I'm so happy that this is a bit lower than what I usually come across on the microphone. Thank you. Yeah, also my thank yous to Jonas, to Bak, to Maria, to everyone who has put effort to organize this, to Jonas, to Evelyn. I'm super happy to be here, needless to say. And actually I will talk about two cases. One of them I spoke a lot about before, but the other has been an experience in 2014-15, and that very much remained there, so I'm actually happy to bring it forward. In the first one, Gezi protests, I will speak from my own position as someone in the park who was in the protests, but then also in the occupation of the park and afterwards. And then the second one, I will talk as a curator who was commissioned by an NGO in Plovdiv in Bulgaria. And through these two, I will try to articulate my position and my arguments on the subject matter. I'll keep the part on Gezi short, on Gezi protests, and afterwards short, and maybe focus more on the curatorial work that I have conducted with the group of people from the NGO actually who asked me, who commissioned me in the first place. Well, the reason for Gezi to happen was a tree. A tree was ripped off the ground, initiating a new urban transformation project to replace Gezi Park with a building of some sort in the center of Istanbul. Probably many of you know this already. The protests and the 3 days of occupation in the park was a reminder of our multitude, our power to gather and claim our space. It was also a reminder that public was confiscated by the state and was privatized somewhere in our national history. The notion of commons was discussed then as this space, the park that was created by people, by us, who were outside the public and the private in the way that are the assumed definitions. In this space, we were all equals, and this equality was beyond an understanding of the humans being equal, but the trees, the animals, who were also part of that space, were part of that equality. Our claim was that the trees belonged to all of us, but belonged to none of us. We collectively belonged to the space, the park, and this went beyond a conventional understanding of ownership. Gezi protest itself could be discussed as a revolt or a revolution in the history of the country, but more importantly, for me and for many of us in the park, it was a personal revolution, in the sense that it has transformed us in a way that we completely shifted our positions and methods in our practices, work, daily life, towards those that are more democratic and more horizontal. Many initiatives came out from Gezi. Therefore, it is as important to talk about the revolution, but also after the revolution. For instance, Northern Forest Defense, you see a snapshot from their website here, is a collective that came out from Gezi. They were established against the government's plans to destroy the northern forests of Istanbul, which also hold the major lakes and other natural habitat. One of their mottos is, we are not for nature, we are part of it. In the discussions of the collective, or with the collective, the notion of commoning gets to be interpreted as living all together, not as a sort of nostalgia or a sense of naivety, as has been alluded before, but as principle. All beings, the stone, the tree, the water, the human, are equal. We have the equal right to exist. We will live for ourselves and for each other. This is, by the way, an anonymous saying from Anatolia. The equality of the stone, the tree, the water, the human. Gezi protests started in June 2013 and took a long while and spread it over the country and actually across the borders. In 2014, I was asked to be the curator of a year-long architecture program in Plovdiv, Bulgaria, by a foundation named ETNO, a non-governmental organization. The theme
Daha
of
baş
the
kültürü
river,
daha
the
dibi
theme
derin
of the program was
işler.
defined as
Daha derin
Maritsa
işler. Şu an
in Bulgarian, Meriç in Turkish,
içinde
Evros
gemiler
in
geziyor
Greek.
mesela.
River.
Taşımacılık yapıyor.
Some of the questions in
Doğudan
picking the
batıya
theme by ethno
bir
were raised
ulaşım yani.
as people not
Bulgaristan'a,
spending time
Yunanistan'a.
by the river becoming an unforgotten element of Plovdiv,
Göçmenler var
and
mesela,
this
siyahi
year-long program
göçmenler.
to be a tool for bringing
Onlar
the people to
geçmek
the river,
istiyorlar.
or let's say the river
Suyun
back to
sıvı
the
olduğunu,
people.
sıvı olduğunu zannediyorlar. Aslında
The
bazı
video
yerlerin
work you
derin
see
olduğunu
here is
hissedemiyorlar.
reflections from Meriç by Nikolai
Onu
Benedict
göremedikleri,
Skyrim
bilmedikleri
Larsen,
için
screened in South Istiklal in
boğuluyorlar.
2014 and later on screened in Plovdiv during our programs. So it was also the time that
Adaların kenarlarında görüyorduk mesela ama onlar birçoğu Yunan
migration from
kısmında
Syria
kalıyordu. Yani
towards
orada
Europe was
ağaçların
raising.
arasında görüyorduk mesela balıkçılık yaparken ama
As an
bir
outsider
şey
to the
diyemezsin
city,
insanlar
how I
suyun
know
ortasında
of
kalmışlar
Maritsa is
mesela,
on the
adada
one hand
kalmışlar.
based on
Alsan
illegalized
Yunan
migration
hükümeti bir başka
and the
var.
more and more strict
Türkiye
European
hükümeti bir
border
başka var.
regime and Frontex, and on the other hand, the destructive floods happening every spring in the city of Edirne in Turkey, where Maritsa reaches
Yazık oluyor
Aegean Sea.
insanlara.
So here
Buraya
we talk
geliyorlar
about two
ama suyu
traumas.
bilmedikleri için de boğuluyorlar.
Literally, the dead bodies
Bilhassa
washing to the
kışın
shores
mesela
of the river
geliyorlar.
that is of human, let's say,
Kışın da su
and the
belli
floods
bir noktada
that is an
derecede
earth
yükseliyor.
trauma that is non-human.
Botlarla geçmek
The
istiyorlar.
program I curated, and I
Tabii
must say it was
botu
a big
kullanmayı
collaboration
bilmiyorlar.
within the
Botu
team at
kullanamadıkları
ETNO.
zaman da
So when I say we
akıntı
here,
onları
it's mostly
deviriyor.
about the people,
Boğuluyorlar,
me and the
gidiyorlar
people in
yani
ETNO.
sağa sola takılıyorlar
So I
mesela.
take little credit. The program included small-scale temporary interventions, lectures, debates, workshops, exhibitions, open school programs, and several open calls and so on. But I won't focus on all of those here, and I will present and discuss some elements of the program that might relate to the discussion here.
Çok zor durumda
During the
kalıyor.
year 2014, part of 2014 and 15, we organized several gatherings by the river, which were fed by and led to a lot of archival research in the municipality and the ministry archives, national newspapers archives, databases of professional organizations, and personal records and photographs of people living by Maritsa. So not only Plovdiv, but as much as we were able to reach out.
Günah değilim, onlar da insan değil mi yani?
I'll try to take it back and bring it to before modernity. So, I mean, during these gatherings, basically, we had a lot of people from different backgrounds, historians, anthropologists, sociologists, also politicians, because the municipality was also involved in the
Ufak çocuklar kışın soğuk,
always got
buz
represented in the
mesela. Çok
program.
soğuk, eksi 18, eksi 20'de.
I'll take it a
Benim
little
de
back
ufacık çocuklar mesela,
to, let's
ufacık
say,
yeni
before
doğmuş çocuklar
modernity
onlarla
and,
beraber karşıya
I'll take
geçmek
it to the
istiyorlar.
present day.
Çok günah bir şey.
So before
Geçemiyorlar da.
modernity, during Ottoman
Soğuklarda
times, the river was a regional
doğanın
network.
içinde mücadele etmeye
For people
çalışıyorlar.
living by the river, there was an
Bu sefer
understanding
ne
of
oluyor?
being
Bunlar
part of nature,
birçoğu da
and
ölümle
supporting this,
sonuçlanıyor yani.
decisions regarding livelihoods, including Maritsa, were made in network
Yardım
local
etmek
governments.
gerekiyor insanlar aslında.
However, modernity, the start of nation states, is maybe the most important threshold for Maritsa in terms of how the river was perceived, treated, and lived on, namely how the river became a project of modernity. I will shortly try to set this in context. I have to stop the film here, but it's also well on time. At the beginning of the 20th century, basically, the national borders among Bulgaria, Greece, and Turkey were drawn, tracing Maritsa River. The river held a very strong image in the identity of the young republic. In this image, you see how the river is the stage for the representation of the military figure. There were major national investments on setting up a railway network and decentralized industry in the country. In Plovdiv, these were settled right by Maritsa. This period also marks the change of scale in making decisions on the river. The river was no longer part of local decision-making, but more centralized at the national level. During the period of socialism, there was even more control over the river. Very rapidly and as large initiatives, dams and locks were constructed along the river, more industry came in along the river. Here we could say that the 20th century of ideological battle of capitalism versus communism or socialism, which occupied and divided Europe, was actually unified in the shared pursuit of triumph over nature. In 1940s, a fair was established by the river as a closed, introverted space for people to gather, so another detachment from the river space. And around at the same time, furthermore interventions were made on the riverbed, which basically made the river into infrastructure space, dams, locks, industry, railroad, bridges, detaching people more and more from the river. 1950s marks significant floods, and since then there has been more than 100 only in Plovdiv, with a lot of casualties and missing people. This is another one from the major flood in 1957, where there were many people homeless. So it was like the anger of the river reflected on people. As precautions, there were more engineering interventions, like changing the course of the river more, building the flood wall, and introducing new species on the riverbed, completely changing the nature of the river. And in this case here, we see the rowing channel that was built on the west side of the river, right next to the river, but the construction of the rowing channel basically shows the complete retreat of the city from the river. So then we bring it to 1990s. I mean, this after the Second World War and let's say the fall of the wall, and then afterwards, what we see is a large-scale privatization of land and infrastructure in the case of Bulgaria and Plovdiv, which is also the story of the rowing channel, in fact. After 2000, there were European Union programs established, including Maritsa River, such as Natura 2000, a framework network program that is about the ecology and sustainability on European rivers. So here you see Maritsa actually suddenly becoming European. Most of the projects under Natura 2000 did not continue because of corruptions and budget cuts. Meanwhile, European Union was investing in Frontex, of course, for the border control. Frontex came to Maritsa, as I remember, only after 2013, when the Syrian migration towards Europe started to accelerate. Concluding this part, we could say for Maritsa that modernity detached the human progress from the natural habitats, and also detached Maritsa from itself as a being that has its own ecology, and transformed it into a natural and national resource. Besides, in this specific case, Maritsa became this border and also the representation of borders between an assumption of nature and culture, public and private, European and non-European. In this context, we could maybe refer to someone like Morton, who claimed that nature has been constructed on the premise of divisions of nature and society. I will be repeating a little bit what was said earlier. Object and subject, between matters of fact and matters of concern, between constative statements and performative ones. The onset of the Anthropocene, where the illusory boundary between the natural world and the social world can no longer be sustained, propels us to move beyond the old notion of a separate nature. Following this, I want to talk a little bit about of an assemblage, but not only non-human, human and non-human assemblages, but also, again, not only animals, trees, air, water, but also myths, gods, and spirits, in continuation of the thoughts I tried to explain earlier. So during some of our research, we found that Ardaskos was the river god of Maritsa, as its representation and protector of it. Here you see it as a print on a coin. And the significant Greek population in Plovdiv would remember this, but they wouldn't anymore because they were displaced to Greece after the First World War. Hence, this was forgotten history for Plovdiv. The ceremony, Roma people purification ceremony, or maybe actually I should just take a step back and say, I mean, the modernity is, of course, it's not the progress and the river becoming the infrastructure space. I talked about it, but it was also the displacement of the peoples. The major population, the very diverse population of Plovdiv before modernity was reduced to Bulgarian ethnicity afterwards. So there's a lot of relation to that in terms of the practices that are related to everyday life and the river. In the case of Roma people, what we see and still see is on the 5th of May, The ceremony includes going in the river and cleaning yourself with the sunrise, during the sunrise. This ceremony represents the energy that animates the land, the same energy that runs through us all. The relationship between Roma people and the river is quite interesting. They believe all things in nature are interconnected and constantly changing. They arise spontaneously from an ultimate source that resists objectification but is immanent in the world and accessible to cultivated people. Vitality and growth is the very nature of existence. Nature exhibits consistent patterns that can be observed and followed, in particular patterns of cycles and interaction between polar forces. One of the things that modernity did in Bulgaria was to replace the water with the church, to shift the locus of Roma people from the river as force of nature to guide human beings' morality to the architecture of a shrine as a political tool to strengthen nationalist belief. In addition, Roma people were pushed to get citizenship and settled in social housing. Agriculture was part of daily life and very much took place by the river. Nature is not here you see actually from 1930s people still drinking water from the river. An understanding of nature is not an entity created by humans, but referring to a state of just how it is. The role of human beings is not to master nature, but to follow its patterns. This would be also in relation to some of the practices in China, as Bozeng would refer to. In the turn of the century, there were people were still living by the river, but not so much anymore. Here, in this case, you see people spending time by, in, and around the river. The river was not only the environment as something in the background, but people were part of it. Armenians were famous for their picnics on Adata, the island. This community was also displaced to Armenia, as well as the Turkish community to Turkey. Some other examples that were collected from the photos of the people, I mean, basically with one open call that was about collecting family photographs from family archives. Another one that's about water sports, and another one that's about bathing by the river. So I'll just come back to some cases from the program that we have organized. I mean, everything that I have told so far is also, let's say, knowledge that is acquired through the conversations and through research during the programs. But basically, based on these conversations, research, discussions, we embraced the notion of commoning and asked, how can we challenge the dichotomies of nature and culture, private and public, European and non-European, in the context of all the history that I have talked about. We came up with programs of river walks, small-scale interventions like urban agriculture, temporary public baths, open school, open programs that could problematize these dichotomies, and also bringing back some of the practices from history and use them as, let's say, utilize them as tools to literally bring the people by the river. So we set up a temporary stage where we organized the talks, and then we started an herbs garden by the river. We mostly used existing but abandoned buildings. An open school was done, learning basically to listen, to look, to smell the river. And also some of the river walks that were organized by the river. And actually, one of the things that we realized, and maybe this is something to discuss later, the river is still used by people. Close by, but not so much visible as practices, let's say. For one of them would be the fishermen, who live far from the center of the city, still relating to the river as they used to do. Another thing we realized was this unknown knowledge on nature. One of the participants in the river walk collecting plants and giving us recipes of medicines that she makes with those plants was an example of this. In the end, we have collected all this material and made a library and donated, let's say, to EDNO. This was an exhibition that was made from the library, and I'm concluding with this last slide. One of the things is, that I want to emphasize is going back to Gezi and bringing back to Plovdiv, to Maritsa, the issue of ownership, belonging, agency, representation. In one of the conversations during the river walks, basically what we realized there were so many narrative contracts between the people and the river, and these were very relational. The narrative contracts, for instance, the process of making medicine, the way that the fishermen used the boat, the way that Roma people clean themselves in the river, the ceremony of it. So one of the things we have managed, and I don't know how far of an achievement is that, but the acknowledgement of such narrative contracts that are very dynamic and changing in nature would be acknowledged in the processes of decision making in the local government level, which might also bring us to some other references from India, but I will skip that. The second is the river belonging to all and belonging to none, as also in reference to Gezi. It is not just that things implicate each other, but things include each other. The story of the whole universe can be explicated from any one point, as Perkins have said in 2015. A mutual relationship between varieties of living things and the inorganic environment, also Minakata Kumagasu would say. The issue, in relation to the issue of rights and representation of the river, I will refer to the notion of commoning as all beings, the equality of all beings. And lastly, the topic of collective knowledge, acknowledging knowing and the unknowingly knowing, or as we would say, it just is, also in reference to Bo Zhang's work from Hong Kong, China. An existence in inherently active and dynamic, and effect is never purely passive or inert. Maybe just one last reference to Lawrence Liang, who revealed the co-evolution of nature, and that nature is not living in the background, as the word environment would suggest, but have actively molded the character, philosophy, aesthetics, and history of peoples, nature altogether as assemblage of human dwelling, and the interconnected and interdependent things commonly ascribed to nature, constituting a more productive path towards sustainability and biodiversity. Thank you very much.